Very good. A little louder. Cool. Well, my name's Matt. I'm an engineering manager at Microsoft, and it's my team's job to defend the hundreds of thousands of machines that run SharePoint Online and OneDrive in Office 365. And I'm here. Thank you. There's something I love about the keynotes. Two things I loved about the keynotes. The theme of humility and documenting our mistakes and bringing them forward to share with others so that you can learn and not repeat them. And second, the culture of giving back. That when you strike gold, you don't keep it to yourself, but you share. And so those are the themes that my talk is built on today. I want to be transparent with you about all the mistakes that I made learning how to build an intrusion detection system for the cloud. And then as I talk about the things that are working for me today, that stuff I want to leave with you, whether that's code that you can go find on GitHub, maturity models that you can evaluate yourself against, or just ideas that you can go back and put into practice. So I'm going to talk through five different areas here. First, I'm going to spend a couple of slides describing the challenge that I'm trying to solve. I think it's really important that we keep security grounded in a real-world business problem, right? This isn't something that we're employed to do for fun. We're employed in this because we have customers that depend on us. I'm going to talk through what we built. I'm going to walk through the things we tried at first. They failed. We tried second. They failed. Eventually, I'll talk about what we learned and what we built in response to what we learned. Then I'll talk a bit about what's next. Having done detection, how are we doing response? And then I'll recap with, as I look back at my career and the pattern that we followed, some recommendations and what I wish someone would have told me ahead of time before I had started on this journey. So the challenge we're trying to solve in Office 365 is we want to help you maximize the value of your intellectual property, of your people, of your collaboration. And what sits on my shoulders every day is that I need to make our cloud safer than any other cloud in the world. And I need to make that guarantee to you, whether you are a small mom and pop shop or whether you are one of the largest customers like GE or Lockheed Martin, and you have a multi-million-dollar security program. So that's a tall order. So we build our system doing all the kind of secure by design things that you would expect Microsoft to do. All right, I'm not going to cover this slide. It's not marketing. It's things we build to make sure that our customer data stays safe. And then, of course, we don't expect that it's safe today just because we built it to be safe 2, 3, 5 years ago. So we have continuous validation programs where we audit the configuration of the system. We bring in external auditors to help make sure that we're walking the walk, not just talking the talk. And the thing that I get the most value out of is our red team. Having people who have full access to our source code, our bugs, our engineers, the passwords they pulled out of previous engagements. These guys are deadly, right? I don't know about you, but I've never met a red team that's not successful. But they're valuable to me because they tell me the truth about myself, right? I could delude myself about the risks that I'm taking or not taking and how realistic those are. But if the red team takes advantage of them, I can't deny that, right? I have to respond. And so this sets up kind of a cognitive dissonance where I look at how successful my red team is. I look at what's happening to other people in my industry. I think like one of the keynotes mentioned this morning, when we see breaches happen in industry, it's not because those people are failures or because they weren't trying their best. They're people just like me that show up every morning, bring integrity and humility, bring a hunger to do the right thing, and they got unlucky. Maybe they took a risk they shouldn't have, and an intrusion happened. That intrusion wasn't detected, wasn't evicted, led to a breach. But that puts me in this conflict with my business goals, right? On the one hand, I come to work every morning excited to deliver on my promise to my customers. But on the other half of my brain, I know that it's just a matter of time. So at Microsoft, we've adopted this notion called assume breach. And that leads me to this conclusion. The only successful way that I can handle this cognitive dissonance is to build adversary resilience. And that's the notion that when a breach occurs, I'm in a foot race with my adversary. He has a kill chain, right? He's going to proceed through this until he gets action on objectives, whether that's stealing my customer's data or whether that's destroying my environment. But the moment that his code starts running in my data center, the moment that he gets access, As a defender, as a network defense team, we kind of have a kill chain too. I need to detect, or I need to gather telemetry from that environment, run analytics against it to detect evidence of an intrusion. I need to get that evidence in front of a human so he can make a go, no-go, true positive, false positive decision. Once I know that, well, now I'm doing incident response, so I need to scope the breach. I need to identify where my adversary is, make a game plan, execute on that game plan, circle back with additional monitoring to make sure that I really have evicted, rather than just taking out, one of the 8 tentacles of the octopus that has control over my data center. So ultimately, I have 2 outcomes if I'm successful or if I fail here. If I'm successful, I'm a firefighter. The house is on fire, and I'm going to put it out and save the occupants inside. But if I fail, I'm just an arson investigator. It doesn't really matter whether I show up to the breach a day late, 2 days late, a week late, a month late. I'm responding after the house is burnt down. And that goes all the way back to business impact. I have to notify all of my customers that their data has been taken. My name shows up in the news. People scroll through my LinkedIn, right? And people will blog about my past and whether I'm well equipped to be doing the job that I'm doing today, right? So it's personal. So 5 years ago, my second son was born, and I shifted from being the engineer that owned the security development lifecycle for SharePoint as an on-premise product, and I had to reinvent myself as a cloud security engineer. And I went to Black Hat in 2012, went to DEF CON, came back, spearfished all of my engineers, and realized, holy crap, I have a completely different threat model than when I burned some bits on a disk and sent that off to someone else to run. So we started trying to build intrusion detection, and we were initially really excited about what we found, right? We found that we had security event logs already being uploaded into this MapReduce system that we call Cosmos, and it's being uploaded every day. We're pretty sure that the logs are complete. Hey, it's called the security event log, right? So I probably have 6 months of maybe doing some queries and building a little scheduler for those jobs. Maybe I'll make a dashboard because those are neat and I'm a visual thinker, and then we'll be done, and I'll move on to the next hard problem. So even before my team really was formulated, we started looking at the data that we had and said, well, what do I have lots of? I have lots of failed logons. And so, engineer number 1 here started building a Power BI table of all the failed logons that had happened in our environment. And it's interactive, so you could hover over a user's name and see how many failed logons they had on which roles, how that was distributed in time, and you could drill in and do stuff. But the fact of the matter is, the only thing that we ever learned about analyzing failed logons was that sometimes my engineers, would type their passwords into the username field, and those passwords were terrible. So, okay, we learned a couple of things, right? On the one hand, I shouldn't be letting my engineers choose their own passwords. I need to build a just-in-time access system that sets their password for them, right, and expires their account after a period of inactivity or after some time has elapsed. I need to take control of the identities in my data center, not leave that into the hands of my engineers. But so we gave up on failed logons, because additionally, talking to our red team and watching them work in my environment, they're not cracking my passwords, right? They're using Mimikatz, they're stealing passwords out of memory and using those to move laterally. So instead, we thought about, well, I don't have red teamers every day in my environment. They are an anomaly. So let's pursue anomaly detection, right? Machine learning was just beginning to be a thing. We thought we were right on the cusp of something big here. So we decided, we are product team engineers. We know what normal looks like. So let's build a massive XML file of filters that define what normal looks like. We will exclude those out of the data set that we look at every day. And then let's look at the rest. And so we started with things like this, these dot plots that we were really proud of because they have like 4 dimensions of data in a 2-dimensional representation, right? These are credential switch events where a user on the left switched their permissions or switched a thread identity to a user on the bottom. All right, so I can see the user from, the user to, like the color tells me which role this happened on, and the size tells me how often. And so we would look at this and really go look up SPO Diag Manager service, and we talk to some engineers and find out, oh yeah, that thing runs workflows on behalf of our engineers. It's supposed to switch to their identity so that the workflow is run with an audit level that identifies who kicked it off. Cool. Write a filter for it, take it out. But no matter how many times we updated our filters, we always had a long tail that kind of looked like this. So we got more sophisticated, and we said, I know, let's build a recommendations model that looks at the processes that each engineer is running, and we will build cohorts of engineers who run processes that are like each other, and if engineer A runs processes that are almost but not quite like engineer B, then that's anomalous, and I'll put them on the dot plot. And this continued, and our triage went from 5 minutes a day to 15 minutes a day to 30 minutes to an hour a day. And eventually my engineers knocked on my door and came in and sat down and they said, Matt, we have a problem. Our problem is we're looking at these dot plots every day, and I know that one day out of every 365, one of these is a red team member. I'm not confident that on that day I'm going to be able to tell the difference between these dots and the dots from the other 354 days, right? They said, we're playing Where's Waldo, right? If we're supposed to be doing our work with integrity, and if we really believe that we're accountable to our customers for the job that we're doing, we can't play Where's Waldo and call that intrusion detection. We need to admit that what we're trying, although it has all the resemblance of data science and it makes pretty charts and it's management approved, it's not delivering on the promise that we set out to deliver on. So we thought some more about this. And we said, well, anomaly detection in itself isn't bad. The problem is that I can't tell which anomalies are benign and malicious. But many of these are occurring on engineer-owned accounts. So why don't I get the engineer involved? So we spent a lot of time crafting a mail that was not threatening. It didn't have the color red anywhere. It invited the engineer to partner with us as we protected his account for him. And we actually got a pretty good click-through rate with this. Our engineers would actually say, yes, this was me, or no, it wasn't. Sometimes engineers would get frustrated because our anomaly detection would take the 2 or 3 engineers that had different privileges and did different work and would email them day after day saying, hey, we saw this on your account and it's anomalous. You'd say, no, I told you yesterday it's not. But this actually worked pretty well. So we moved on to something more sophisticated and said, I know, I'm going to build a Markov chain model. I'm going to use machine learning to look at the pattern of processes that executes in a given logon session, with the hypothesis that the processes that my engineers run when they're in the environment is going to be different, either in timing or in sequence or just in the kind of processes that they run, versus an adversary or versus a red team member. And so we'd build this great big model. It would take multiple hours a day to cook in our MapReduce system. We did a bunch of post-processing to make it look pretty, and we would send these to our users. And every time, they'd go back and they'd click, no, I don't recognize this. And this was really frustrating to us because we spent a bunch of time post-processing this to turn it into this, right? But the fundamental lesson for us was that our engineers don't actually understand their own behavior, right? A script has been checked into source control. It was reviewed by someone else, right? That chain of custody is good, but the person who runs it, they didn't write the script. They didn't check it in. They don't know what it launches. They see, I ran PowerShell and then some things happened. There were no boxes popping up. I don't know what MMC is, right? The other thing that was challenging for us with machine learning was we would spend a bunch of time training a model, and if you've worked in data science, you know that one of the ways you evaluate the model is by pulling up the inverse log probability of seeing a given event and plotting that and saying, look, after I train my model, I run it against my real-world data set. Look, my red team activity is up here in the top. I bet if I were to draw a line somewhere down here and just exclude those out of my daily triage, you only have to look at the top 10. Oh, this looks pretty good. But every week or two, it started to look like this. Because we were faced with an issue called class imbalance, or it's actually not called class imbalance. It's called concept drift, where the environment that we trained our model on was no longer the environment that we were running today. Because we had deployed new machines, we had deployed new roles, we had rolled out patches that changed the way that the data center worked. We had hired new people, we'd had different kinds of incidents that required different kinds of fixes. And so we were left not being able to trust our model because our model would tell us that we constantly had anomalies. And so what we figured out was, maybe we're actually going in the wrong direction. So my mentor, John Lambert, had this great explanation on Twitter of the problem that we were hitting. We were down here, where we had a ton of data, terabytes a day. We were building ever more sophisticated models on that data, and it was steering us in the wrong direction. We weren't getting any closer to our destination. And I kind of liken this to Aesop's fable about the princess and the pea. I have a little disturbance I'm trying to find at the bottom of the bed, and I'm sticking more and more mattresses on it, and I'm building ever more sensitive mattress top detectors looking for that imperfection. But maybe stacking more mattresses isn't actually the thing that I'm trying to do. Maybe my data is bad, not my analytic technique. So I had to step back for a third time, reinvent ourselves, and figure out how are we going to solve this problem. And the thing we tried next that actually seems to work was focusing on our adversaries, on their behaviors, rather than focusing on the data that we have, or focusing on the anomalies in the data that we have. Because it turns out that I'm not looking for anomalies. That's not my job. My job is to find security intrusions. Not all anomalies are security interesting, right? But if I take an adversary focus, I go study them, whether that's I partner with my red team, I turn purple and I watch how they work. I take their tools, or I take the tools that I'm reading about in breach reports. I replay them in my environment, and I look to see what evidence gets left behind. Right? So I go back to my kill chain. I sit with my red team, I look at their reports, I try to understand how do they do their job. Because when I'm starting this, they're the best thing I have to a real-world adversary. I want them to emulate one so that I'm practicing against the most difficult adversary possible before I face a real one. So I walk through, I figure out how they get their job done. And then this is Edmond Lacard. He's the father of modern forensic science. And his contribution to the field was this exchange principle that every contact leaves a trace. And this is the notion that if a physical, real-world criminal goes to a crime scene, commits a crime, and leaves, some pieces of that crime scene are left on him when he walks out, maybe fibers from the carpet in his shoes, and some bits of him were left behind in the crime scene, maybe fingerprints or hair or stuff from his jacket. Well, the same thing holds true for us as well, right? When I replay my adversary's techniques, that leaves evidence. It's my job to find it, get it through my blue team kill chain, and get it in front of someone who can act on it. So we went about hunting for evidence, and we found it in two places. We looked at real-time evidence, looked at event-based activity, and said, sometimes I can find it in the event log. Those opportunities are few and far between, but sometimes they're there and I should take advantage of them. More often, though, these behaviors are recorded in a subsystem of Windows called ETW. You've probably seen it sprinkled throughout the Derbycon schedule this weekend. This is a subsystem that is built into Windows, and it's actually used by Windows engineers for tracing, for debugging, for performance analysis. And they happen to leave that in as part of that system when they ship Windows. So we get to take advantage of it. If I can't find real-time activity, or maybe the real-time activity is too fast, it's too high in volume for me to take advantage of, then I can take snapshots of the machine state. Now, I have the luxury of trying to defend 100 to 200,000 machines that are mostly homogeneous. Right? They're deployed in a data center in a consistent fashion. So I can use that homogeneousness against my adversary. And say, if I take a snapshot of security interesting registry keys across 200,000 machines, and one of them's different, that sticks out. I should go follow up on that, even though I don't have an oracle that defines for me ahead of time what normal looks like. So we kind of ended up with this model where I have my adversary's tools, techniques, and practices. I have evidence from ETW or from my machine snapshots. And then the fact is there are humans in my environment that are trying to get their work done. They're trying to do break-fix activities, and I have automated activity as well that's trying to run the service. So where my adversary TTPs generate evidence in ETW, well, that's evidence. I want to pick that up. Where my TTPs overlap with my engineer's expected activity, that's poor hygiene that I need to get rid of, right? That's a signal-to-noise ratio issue. If my red team uses PSExec and my engineers use PSExec, I have a problem. Hopefully, my real engineers are not using Mimikatz, so I can write a good detection for that. That's not always true, it turns out. And where expected activity overlaps with ETW, I need to do a bit of filtering. Right? All those lessons that I learned or techniques that I tried to apply earlier in my career, they're still valid, but I'm going to apply them smartly to better data. And if I'm successful at all of this, then I can build a halfway decent intrusion detection sensor. So we built just that. We built a little agent that we deploy on every machine that subscribes to ETW events, has some internal snapshotting capabilities. And the way this works is it has kind of an asynchronous pipeline that accepts ETW on the left and sends it off to multiple things to either aggregate or decode or store or correlate, or sometimes, like with WMI, just write it out to the security event log. I wish that it was written already. This way I can get it there. That eventually ends up in the security event log, and that gets uploaded to our security data lake, so we can do MapReduce jobs against it, so our analytics run. And then sometimes I can do things that are so simple that I can fire an alert directly from the agent. And so I don't think about this as being a bulletproof, end-all, be-all, cures cancer little sensor that I deploy everywhere. I think about it as special goggles that give me a view into Windows 2025, when Windows finally audits everything security interesting that I wish had been there from the get-go, right? So this is me filling in gaps that hopefully the Windows team will eventually take back. And they're actually starting to do that with products like Defender ATP, where I look at the way they've instrumented Windows and the things they're able to detect, and I can turn off detections that I have, because maybe they have a better process injection detection than I do, for instance. So there's a wealth of things, it turns out, that you can do with ETW. Right? The thing that hooked us on it from the get-go was that we could see all of the TCP and UDP activity on the machine. We were doing incident response. We discovered our red team's command and control IP, and we needed to find out how many other machines was talking. And that query in our MapReduce system would have been very slow. So we quickly wrote a little agent, distributed it out to the entire environment, and found everywhere that was calling back. Said, this is generally useful. Right? When I get an ETW event, it tells me the thread and the process ID that was making the connection. So I can build a beautiful map of every process in my environment and every destination that it's making an outbound call to. And remember, I have a homogeneous large-scale environment, so I can look horizontally across that data, and everything should collapse and line up. If I have an outlier, that's security interesting. I get to see WinINet, all the headers, both request and response, even if you're doing SSL, which is pretty handy. You can see PowerShell method execution, even if I'm running, say, PowerShell 2 or PowerShell 3.5, and I don't have transcription or script block logging turned on. I can see WMI queries, WMI method execution. So if somebody sneakily tries to launch a process on a remote machine using WMI, I can pick that up. I can see WinRM, so I can decode Windows remoting, or Windows Remote PowerShell connections, both on the source and the target. I get to see DNS, both on the domain controllers and on every client. And so I can build a whole data set that shows me which DNS resolutions are happening to what name servers and what responses came back, all the way back to which specific client made that query and how much data was it. After we had started to show success with this, we had kind of a forum with the rest of Office 365 and some other defenders around the organization. And this was the slide that I brought to them when they asked me to explain our strategy. I was seeing kind of a bifurcation, two different strategies in the organization. One strategy is that, well, if I look at that blue team kill chain, if I can make the data get as quickly as possible through my analytics and to a human, then I've reduced a lot of time there. Right? So maybe I need a real-time streaming event system. I need to build something on Spark. I need to ingest data with Kafka and run those real-time analytics and get that in front of a human. The alternative approach is to say, it's not the speed of my data processing that's the problem. It's the data itself. It's the granularity of the data. It's not telling me what I need it to. So I'm willing to accept a slower pipeline in the beginning if it means that I'm more accurately responding, even if it's 6 to 12 to 24 hours late. Where we've ended up, when we talk to our red team or when we kind of watch our visibility on activity inside the data center, is instead of being caught in the defender's dilemma, where we have to be perfect all the time, otherwise we will, if we slip up once, our adversary will get in. Now we've created what I call the defender's dilemma, or the intruder's dilemma. This is a term coined by Richard Vetlick back in 2009. It's not new. I don't get to take credit for it. But it's the notion that as a defender, I need one detection for me to start incident response. And if I pepper my environment with enough detections along my adversary's kill chain, it's extremely unlikely that he'll be able to get from foothold to actions on objectives without triggering one. Now that I have that and I can prove it in practice, now let's talk about how to make that pipeline go faster. Is everyone with me? Good. So we spent a bunch of time on intrusion detection, but that really only got us into gather and detect. All right, I still have all the stuff on the right. And what we learned was that incident response would still take between 3 and 5 days working with our red team, let alone if this is a real intrusion, right? So we started to think more about how we can make that faster. The first thing we looked at was with our alerts. You know, they used to come in kind of as plain text into our incident management or ticketing system. We'd scroll through them and highlight the ones that were similar and resolve them, and then come back the next day and do the same thing. But we realized that our data was actually pretty well structured if we would take the time to break it out and put it in something like Elasticsearch or SQL. It said, you know, I have some fields here that really should be first-class columns in that data set. I have detection types, host names, usernames, IP addresses, process starts. So we did this, and it was pretty useful because now I can sort and filter and group. I can build rules that specifically target a user and a process and a machine role or a machine type and filter that out instead of trying to do regular expression matching, right? So we took this and we iterated on it for a little while, and then I went home at Christmas. And my tradition is that when I go home and I visit my family, we put the kids to bed at night. Right? We spent the rest of the day with the family, and I sit at the kitchen table with my laptop, and I hack on something. And on the flight down, I had kind of been bitten by the bug that, you know, maybe I could cluster these things together. For example, this first line, I have this anomalous DLL event. Well, let's represent that as a node that's connected to all of the entities, the users, hosts, processes, what have you, that are attached to that detection event. Well, why don't I do the same thing for the next one? But I'm not going to ever duplicate those entity nodes. Right? If a username or a machine name already exists, I'm going to attach myself back to it, and so on and so forth. And the hypothesis was that maybe this would connect related activity together in the same way that a human responder does when he's triaging alerts. Right? If I see something interesting on a given account, the next question I ask is, well, what else did that account do? Or it's on a machine. What else happened on that machine, both forwards and backwards in time? So it turns out that this actually worked really, really well for us. We found clusters like this, where we'd have one detection type. Each color is a distinct type of detection that happened on a whole set of machines, and there's no other kind of related activity. Every single one of these turns out to be a false positive. Right? It's that concept drift problem again, where our environment changed, our detections are picking up new activity, and as humans, we need to apply our service context to decide whether this is benign or malicious, and if it's benign service activity, filter it out. But this big group of related activity is actually red team activity. And this did a really good job of pulling all the detections together and showing it like in one united kind of cluster. So I'm a visual thinker, and so the way that we experimented with this to prove out the hypothesis was to build a little web app that took live data from our detections, brought it in, used the Cytoscape.js rendering framework in JavaScript to pull out all of these clusters and let us sort through the clusters. So each one of these on the right that I'm going up and down through is one of the clusters that is here. What we found was that, man, our red team activity here stood out like a sore thumb. And so my mind is racing with analytics that I can do on top of this. I can take all my alerts, cluster them, and then rank them by the number of distinct detection types that are in there. I could give it a score based on the distribution of those detection types versus the number of machines that each detection fired on. Because I know that when I see one detection on a lot of machines, it's probably a false positive, and I should downvote that. And so we thought about applying things like PageRank to apply maybe the anomalousness of each detection back to the entities that were associated with it, so that when I have an intrusion, I can tell my investigator where to start first. We even thought, maybe I should be able to right-click and trigger remediation workflows directly from this interface. So we were pretty quickly convinced, after looking at this for a couple of weeks worth of data, that this is actually, it's workable, right? Instead of hundreds or, many hundreds of individual distinct alerts to look at, now we have 20 to 30 clusters a day to look at. And everything's grouped together. We look at 7 days worth of data. So even if I make a decision today and I say, this looks benign, if there's more correlated activity tomorrow or the next day, I'll see it again. And so this helps backstop my engineers and says, if you make a bad judgment call because you didn't have sufficient information to make an accurate judgment call, you'll have the opportunity to revisit that the next day when that data shows up again. And so, we look at this in our day-to-day in a tabular view because works a little bit better for us. We can see more data. It's denser. You can sort and filter. But underneath the covers, we're doing alert clustering. So that was helpful. But we still had the struggle of when I do see a true positive detection, how quickly can I expand across those other 100, 200,000 machines and find related activity? Maybe my detections didn't pick it all up, right? I need to do some ad hoc queries. So we gather 10 to 12, maybe more data, terabytes of data every day from our event logs. We store that for a year plus. And pivoting or querying over this is very, very slow. Sometimes it'll take an hour to make that initial query and then discover that now you want it caused you to ask a different question. So you do another hour's worth of query. If each one takes an hour, you get 24 tries at it in a given day if you decide that you don't want to sleep. So clearly this isn't working for us. So we thought back at the kind of data that we had in our agent. And we said, let's pick off a simple case like, I know that an IP address is bad, not because some threat intel list told me so, but because I'm responding to an intrusion that my analytics found. And this IP address is associated with that intrusion behavior. So we built a cloud service where we put IP addresses, domain names, process regexes, things that we find during incident response. Those get synced down by our agent. And the next time any agent sees an indicator of that activity, it gives us a paging alert, calls back. And so now we can watch our adversary move from machine to machine once we have a solid indicator for him, rather than being behind the ball trying to catch up with our event log queries. That works pretty well. The next thing we wanted to ask was, okay, I found malware that's calling out to an IP address. I pull a copy of it, I look inside, I find maybe some strings or a byte pattern that uniquely identifies it. Well, I can't tell my agent to just look at memory constantly and look for the next time that occurs. So we built Yara into our agent and said, okay, agent, maybe there's 200,000 of you. I want all of you to do this Yara scan against all the process memory on your machine or against all the files on disk that match this pattern. I want to distribute that query gradually so that I don't impact the health of the service, right? My customers shouldn't know that I'm doing incident response, not because I don't want to leak information, but because just like security is a pillar, so is availability and reliability and performance, right? I want to be a good citizen within my service infrastructure. So this built for us a really neat virtuous cycle where we would be in responding to a case, we would add that IP address as an IOC, and then we'd start to get alerts within 15 minutes from machines that had synced it down and were observing communication to that IP. So we'd go on those boxes, or we'd use our tools remotely to interact with our agent, and we would dump process memory from the processes that were calling out to those IPs. We'd build Yara rules for that, and we'd distribute that job across our environments and say, hey, who else has hits for malware that looks like this? And we'd get back a list of processes that match those indicators. And the funny thing is, our red team is good at segregating their infrastructure and using different, not related command and control infrastructure. So we would find different processes that matched the malware sample than all the processes that were calling out to the IP address that we knew about. So that gives us new network indicators, right? We put that back into the service and we get a new list. And this virtuous cycle helps us move really quickly and helps us watch our adversary at the tempo that they work. So when I look back at the pattern that we followed and the things that I've done, there's a maturity model that I wish someone would have shared with me before I started on this work. Turns out all of this is grounded in having a solid inventory, right? If you can't count or name the assets that you're responsible for defending, you probably can't do a good job of defending it all. I'm seeing smiles, like how many people had to struggle with this with WannaCry and NotPetya, making sure that SMB is turned off on all of the machines, not just the ones you know about, right? Making sure that security patches are present on every machine, not just the ones you think you know about. For the longest time, we hoped that someone else would solve this for us. And it's only in about the last 3 months that we've realized, no, we are the ones who care the most about having an accurate inventory of every machine that's online and responding to network events. Once I know my inventory, well, now I can be confident that I have telemetry from each one of these machines. Maybe I use Windows Event Forwarding. Maybe I install an agent. Maybe I directly upload to an Elk stack, or I push things to Kafka or an Event Hub. Once you have that, the next thing to build is just simple detection. Pick something that's against company policy, right? Pick a process that you should never see running and figure out how you're going to do that detection against the data and the telemetry that you have in the data pipeline that you have. That's going to cause you to get alerts. Those alerts will need to go in front of a human. You'll need to have some triage processes, workflows, training, SOPs, or troubleshooting guides to deal with the alerts that people are getting. If you can do that, okay, step back now. You have a detection, you have a pipeline that's working end to end that you can demonstrate. Now, who are the threats to your business? Right? Given the kind of industry that you're in, given the kind of data that you have, who are your adversaries? Okay, go pull as much intelligence and information and breach reports as you can about those adversaries. How do they operate? What tools do they use? Right? If somebody like Matt Dunwoody gives a talk about how APT29 gets their job done, and that APT actor fits your threat profile, and you want to go find him after the talk and piece apart everything you can about how that adversary works, how he gets his job done. Because you want to learn how to find his behaviors in your environment. And then maybe you added those detections today, but you've had that data for the last 6 months. Now you need to hunt through it to see whether maybe he was present before you added that analytic, right? Okay, now you feel comfortable. You've tested this with red teaming. You convinced your red teamers to emulate the adversaries that you believe are like a realistic threat to your business. You can confidently detect them. You're comfortable hunting because now you know what to do when you detect. Well, how's your ability to actually respond to that adversary in your environment? If you can detect him early in his kill chain, can you watch him move in real time as you build your response plan? Or are you 24 to 48 hours behind trying to do queries and deal with that ever-expanding scope as you learn new information? Okay, you can track your adversaries. You have the data. You can see what's going on. How quickly can you take action? So for instance, let's take the IP address example. Okay, we went from Windows doesn't tell me anything about network activity in the security event log to I deployed an agent that gave me every network connection that a process initiated in my environment, to I put IP IOCs in the cloud and I get paging escalations the moment that a new machine starts talking to that IP address. I'm only halfway done, right? As part of eviction and remediation, I need to block access to that IP. And depending on the organization that I'm in, it might be challenging to get the network operations center on the phone and get them to update their core routers, and have them take the risk of a config update that takes down the network. Maybe instead I can sinkhole that IP address directly on the machine using my agent by either adding a static route to map it back to 127.0.0.1, or if the adversary is using DNS, I can add a hosts file entry to, again, point it back to localhost. And if you can do that, if you can disrupt an adversary in 24 hours or less in your own environment, go find trusted partners that face the same threats that you do. Go work with them, right? Expand your impact outside of your organization. This follows kind of a 1, 2, 3, like crawl, walk, run sort of maturity model, right? When we had built the bottom, we were working on anomaly detection. We were so proud of ourselves when we would find engineers that downloaded Chrome in the data center because they were trying to reproduce a customer issue that only happened when you were using Chrome. We said, look, these guys totally violated business policy, pat, 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 right? But our red teamers were still incredibly successful. When we started to hit the next level, and we had detections that covered our red teamers' kill chain, now we started to feel better because we weren't just relying on one lucky detection. AV happened to go off, and now we're on to you. No, we actually see enough of your activity that we can construct the timeline of this intrusion with pretty good fidelity, just from looking at the intrusion detection results without really doing DFIR. But at the top is where you want to strike gold. Not only can you see your adversary moving, but you're operating at the same tempo as them to monitor them, to watch them, and to disrupt them. So that's me. I have about 10 minutes for Q&A. Zach in the front row is going to talk about the ETW library that we use internally in our agent. He's speaking tomorrow on Saturday. We released it as open source. It's C++ and C#. So if you want to go build your own little agent that uses ETW to monitor malware behavior as you're doing investigations, or to build a similar agent, he'll get you started. Yeah. Yeah. The question was, when we do alert clustering over 7 days of data, are those snapshots or is it a sliding window? It's a sliding window. Yeah. Great question. Anyone else? Yeah. You're asking if it's the same talk in Israel? I'm sorry, I can't. My ears are bad. I can't quite hear you. Sorry, so I gave a very similar talk in Israel in January. Yeah, good question. Anyone else? Yeah, in the front row. Yeah, good question. What was the impact of what was the impact on the time it took for us to analyze our daily, or do triage, basically? That was something that I was really concerned about. So before we did alert clustering, I was watching triage take longer and longer and longer, and I was hearing from my engineers about how triage was taking longer and longer and longer. Because at that point, you're scrambling to add as many detections as you can across as much kill chain as you can, which means you're getting more results every day. Because the long tail is really long. We found that clustering has made it pretty much consistent, and the goal of the clustering was to, I call it bending the curve, right? As I add more detections, it's going to look like this. I need it to look like this, where instead of triaging each individual detection result, I'm triaging clusters, and there should only be so many clusters. Maybe the clusters are getting higher fidelity as I gather more data about each one. But I shouldn't be looking at 100 and then 200 and then 400 and then 1,000 results a day. So it has stayed, I'd say, fairly constant. Yeah. Probably have time for one more if somebody has a question. Yeah. Good question. So the question was, how granular is our IOC format? Do we have like a parent-child format for it, where we have threat actor that does n things, or is it just, I have an IP address and then a name associated with it? It's the latter. It's really simple. It's basically a dictionary in the cloud of, indicator type, indicator value, what severity is it when we see the indicator, and then who added it and when. I would love to deploy MISP and get more sophisticated with it. We do run our data against threat intel feeds from both internal and external threat intelligence. But for paging alerts, we've really seen the best results by taking like handcrafted IOCs that against threat actors that we've directly observed. So, cool. Thanks guys for taking the time.